Continuing with drawing 22, we're up to making the radiator shroud. We'll need Ezio to make our forming buck that we can then shape the parts around it.
I'm now looking at drawing 22, and this is referring to part B6, which is the buck for our radiator and grille. Our radiator buck, as you can see, is 40 millimeters wide, and it's made by using two 17mm pieces of form ply with a 6mm piece of ply sandwiched in between the two. We'll be screwing those together. The process of making this is exactly the same as what you've previously done. We need to cut out our template, put our shape on our material, cut it all out with whatever equipment you have handy, and then we'll be drilling holes to assist with clamping. To make the radiator buck, we need to cut out our template B6 and transfer all those measurements onto our material. In the marking out process, when you're marking out the centres of your holes and the position of your screws, on the second piece of our form ply, don't forget to offset the screws so that they don't hit one another. Once you've completed the marking out, the cutting process is exactly the same as what you've done on previous bucks. As you can see, I've pre-drilled all my holes and I'll be screwing the three pieces together. The only difference is with this one is that I'll be routering an edge around just as marked out on the plan. Referring to my drawing of the radiator buck, you can see that it's got rounded over corners on there. In fact, it runs all the way around our project, only on one face though. I'm using a 13mm round over cutter with the guide, and I'll be doing half at a time. Job is clamped down, and I'll release the clamps, turn it around and do the other half. Do a test run first, unplugged, just to make sure the router clears your clamps. Or alternatively, you could use a router table. I now have the router set up to do the job in one pass. Depending on how confident you are with your router, it might be a good idea to do it in two passes. I've now completed the rounding over process. I'm just going to give it a little touch up with sandpaper just to smooth the edge over, but the job is complete. I'm now going to hand it over to Vaughan.
We've got our forming buck back now. We need to make our three parts. Part number 119, 120A and 120B. We'll have to cut out template T22. All the parts are made out of 1mm mild steel. It's 784 long by 35mm wide. T23 is 200mm long by 62mm wide. T24 is 784 long by 62mm wide. Once you've cut the templates out of the top section, don't throw the bottom piece away. We'll be using this as reference for our internal mounting flange and also the grille that we'll be making later. We've cut our three templates out, so we're ready to start with the backing strip. But to put everything in context, we'll go and have a look on the car. The three parts that we're about to make start at part number 119. This is support for the bonnet. Where it shuts, it needs to sit nice and flush. It's also welded to part number 120A, which is our radiator shroud. Part number 120B is the lower radiator support. We'll need our forming buck to shape all these pieces together. You can also see 119 has a slight recess so that all these panels will sit and end up flush. Let's start making part number 119. We've previously laser cut this piece. So on machinery made, the method is the short or 15mm edge gets folded to 90 degrees. Then we shrink the short edge between these two gussets, which will create our radius. The gusset is located here, shrinking across until we get to the other gusset. When using hand tool method to make part number 119, what we've got to do is transfer all these red marks, gussets, lobster back, etc., onto our piece here, the short edge. Then what we do is we'll take that marked piece, flip it over, fold it up 90 degrees, Then we can bring it over to our forming buck, clamp, and start to pull this around manually where our sections have been cut out. As we progressively do that, clamp and just keep moving on. To transfer this information, what we'll do is with our spring center punch, the base of the apex of the triangle, we'll mark that, then the outer edge, etc. And we do that for each and every single one. These are simply a 1mm cut-off disc slot. Once we remove these sections, that will allow the material to collapse on itself. To fold this section, we'll be using a piece of 50 by 50 angle line. We're lucky enough to have a welding table. You can see we'll be clamping it. Our marked piece will be facing downwards, so this flange gets folded up. Later on, what will happen, the marks will be facing us in the vise when we go to cut it. If you put it on the inside, the marks will be on the inside and you won't be able to see it. If you don't have a welding table, what you can do is get another section of 50 by 50 angle line, get the piece that faces down on the bottom, another piece on top, sandwich your steel between the two pieces of angle line, F-clamp every 100, 150 millimeters. So the process of folding it, we're going to initiate with a nylon hammer. So it's very soft. We don't want to stretch it too much. Then coming along with a block of timber and just gradually work it over, and we'll finish it with a spring hammer to get a nice sharp fold. First pass is about 25 degrees. Second pass we get to about 45, 60 degrees. Third pass we'll get to about 80 degrees. Then I'll bring the timber in on its end and start working across. What the spring hammer is going to do is give us a sharp angle where the base of the material is. We've completed our fold. The next piece of work is to cut these gussets or lobster back sections out. We're going to do that with a 1mm cut-off disc on a grinder, or you could use a hacksaw. They do need to be done accurately. Now I've cut the gussets or slots out. What we're going to do is use our timber hammer form. We'll be overlaying the center line of the piece onto the center line of the forming buck. We then clamp, F-clamp this, and I'll be using the nylon hammer and working my way down around the radius on each side. We can then pull the bottom down. The second step in the process is we remove it from the forming buck, flip it on the back side as it would be on the car, and then we'll be fine-tuning to ultimately weld it together. We've done the bulk of the work, so what I'm going to do now is attach a couple more clamps just to help hold this in, and then just go over it and get it to stress relieve into form or shape. Then we'll be pulling it off and reversing it. The initial forming work is done, so now we can release it from the vise, our F-clamps, etc. We can put it on the workbench, turn this piece the other way around, then we can start to tighten up the radius, which will also decrease the gaps between here so that we can then later on weld. The next step in the process of making is we need to attach through the center line of the forming buck. We clamp with a 3mm offset from the outside of the forming buck to the brace. We can then clamp, tack in sequence, working your way down. Now, if you've got a work table, what we'll have to do is spin it around, clamp this section with a G-clamp, work your way down, keep pulling it, make sure you keep that 3mm offset. We're going to be using a welding table, and all these holes allow us clamping points that we can quite easily and quickly form and tack in place on the welding table. I've set it up on the welding table. The first starting point is the center line. So I've clamped the center line and then I've worked my way outwards, retaining that 3mm offset between the outer face and the inner face. So then what we do, as you work your way around, simple hand tools and just keep working it to retain that 3mm. When you get the correct offset, we then will come in with a clamp, attach it and move along, might be another 2 clamps, etc. Then we can start to weld it, tack all our gaps. We can then spin it around and repeat the same process on the other side. I've got this side set up now. The process was actually quite quick because as I've got it to sit into the correct radius and the offset with hand tools, just simply working it, I've then in sequence clamped it so it's correct. This half can now be welded. If you're doing it on a work table, you'll probably want to do maybe 2 sections at a time, release, reposition, and then continue the process step by step. That was a bit of a process. We're almost finished now. We need to sand the inside face. We've got a little bit of overhang. Don't worry about that because we'll finish that later. This face here has to be nice and smooth because it mates up against the back of the radiator shroud. We're up to part number 128, the radiator shroud. We're going to be using machinery to make this part. So we'll be folding the back edge and using a shrinker. With that, we'll then be attaching it to our hammer form and we'll be rolling the nose over using hand tools. If you're using hand tools only, then the same process that we've just done for part number 119 will be followed. Cutting the gussets out, that's your back edge. Then the front edge will also be using our hammer form and rolling that nose over. I've completed the fold and attached with F-clamps to the forming buck. This point right here will bend down until it closes up. Then we'll be shrinking along this face to create that radius. From there, this section here will also be clamped and we'll pull it into place. Then we can start to weld the 2 gussets. I've finished shrinking across the top. Now I'll be pulling the last section down. So this will close up and that will close up the same. What I'll then have to do is a little bit of hammering across here because this face is actually pulled out of alignment a little bit. It's not quite 90 degrees, it's about 85 degrees. So we'll get that nice and flat. Then we can actually weld these 2 sections and we can move on to the front. I've welded the 2 gusset cuts on the back side. So now we're ready to begin the forming process of the nose of the radiator. You do that by simply using a tinsman's mallet or a soft blow hammer, getting the front of the edge of it to collapse slightly. Then we use a spring hammer and we go over that to really get it to form and sit quite tight up against the forming buck. Make sure you do it nice and neatly, otherwise you're going to have to do metal finishing later. Then we've also got to do little welds here in the corner where the gussets are. You can notice here that it's already beginning to roll about 16-18 mil in from the outside flange. However, when it comes to this radius, what you've got to get it to do is to collapse in sections. Don't simply hit it hard at one point because then it will create a pucker that we'll have to work out later. So what I'm doing is progressively working my way backwards and forwards. 20 degrees, etc., and continually working it down and backwards and forwards. If you do see any puckers starting to form, work them out and gradually work backwards and forwards. These areas, after we remove our radiator shroud from the forming buck, we'll be smoothing these out with our hammer and dolly. So now I've completed this side and most of across the top, I can then reorientate and finish this side. I've finished forming most of the radiator shroud. Once you've got it a good fit, we can then move on to the next part. T20B, which is the bottom. We'll need to cut out T23, our template. With that, what we've also got to do is punch and elongate a couple of holes. Later on, that will form the basis where it's bolted onto the chassis. It will give us a little bit of adjustment for our headlight support bar, also a bit more clearance on our bonnet when it's finally painted. I've finished cutting out the lower piece. I've also center punched from the template our 2 center points for our 6mm hole. I'll then go through each of these holes with a 3mm drill bit, followed by a 6mm drill bit on both, but take your time, it may rip the metal. We can then, through the middle part, use a small engineer's file and get that nice elongation. Now I've done the elongations, the next step is to fold the back face at 90 degrees. We'll have an overlap here that we can then mark, scribe, and cut 45-degree mitre. If there's any intolerance, differences, etc., we can take that up now, because that will allow a little bit of latitude for adjustment. Once we've done our 45-degree cuts, we can then F-clamp back on the forming buck and roll the nose around exactly how we've done previously. I've just finished radiusing the front lower nose edge over. The next thing we have to do is start tacking these pieces together. So we've got to make sure the alignment is correct. We also need to make sure it's square. We'll get a small pair of vice grips and connect these two together. Make sure it stays flush because it's going to be a butt weld. First thing we're going to do is tack in the corner, then our other pair of vice grips in the back corner, also square. Then we can work our way down the vertical face, tack there, tack the vertical face on the other side. I've just come back from tacking the lower piece in place. We've got a little bit of a gap here that we can close up using our T-dollies. So a straight T-dolly into the corner. Also a curved T-dolly will help dress up around the top of the radius. So we'll close all these little gaps up and then we'll finish welding it. These 4 corners are now ready to tack weld. If you're a competent welder, start on the inside where it's the thinnest and work your way down. If you're not as confident, get some 2mm copper, pre-form it to sit in the corner, because what it will do is form support material that won't weld to the piece. So when you release the copper with vice grips, etc., once you've released that, you'll find the inside of the weld will be very smooth and neat. We've finished welding it. Now we need to smooth the weld. I'll do that by using a flat disc, and ultimately we'll be finishing it, the weld, with an engineer's file. So be very gentle with the flat disc, sanding, belt linisher, anything that you use, because it's quite thin. It's already 1mm, so you don't need to make it any thinner. We're up to the metal finishing part on our radiator shroud now. So we'll be using our curved T-dolly again, or T-dollies, hand dollies, hammer, and an engineer's file for the final finishing. Just make sure your tooling fits the radius correctly, and as you're filing it, just systematically work as we've done previously on the guards. Continue the process of metal finishing and filing all the way around the radiator shroud. Then with a little orbital sander, 80 grit, followed by 120, Once that's completed, then we can get our bonnet support brace that we previously made and welded two together. I've finished sanding the radiator shroud. I've also sanded the welds in the corner for the bonnet support. We can now set the two up together. Don't forget we need a 3mm offset between the shroud and the bonnet support. So now all we have to do is place our vice grips. I've vice gripped the inner support and also the outer shell together with a 3mm offset all the way around. What I've done on the bottom here is one side is slightly shorter than the other. So this one here will remark it and will also shorten that. It gives you a little bit of clearance on the chassis so you're not going to scratch the paint later on. So now what we can do is literally start to mark every 50mm to then have a 3mm hole that will be plug welding, but you can use pop rivets or fasteners. Once we've got that, then we'll separate the two. I've finished drilling out with the 3mm drill. We now need to just trim the end off. Then, because we're plug welding this one, we'll go through with 5mm drill through all these holes. We've then got to deburr and apply weld through primer to this face and that face. Put the two back together, tech screw every second hole. The holes where there's no tech screws, we plug weld, remove the tech screws, then finish plug welding. That's our radiator shroud finished. The next part we're up to is part number 121. It's template T16, and that's the perforated radiator grill or mesh. We're making it out of 1.6 alloy. Holes can vary depending on your supplier, but we need to make it out of alloy because it's slightly wider than the opening, so we just need to curl it up, get it in there, and then release it. I've marked out the template onto the aluminium sheet, so I'll be using these throatless shears to cut around the radius. That's actually what they're for, to cut a concave or convex radius. I've finished cutting out our grill. What we're going to have to do is, using our hammer form, radius the edges over, because our radiator shroud, the grill will sit nearly flush, a very slight 1mm difference. If you don't put a radius on it, what will happen is there'll be about a 5mm gap between the radiator shroud and the grill. It won't look right. What we're going to do is radius these edges all around the perimeter. So to do that, I'll be using the spring hammer and working my way around. But we need to clamp it to the bench top. Make sure your piece is centered on the hammer form, and then just a piece of scrap, F-clamp, so we don't buckle or distort the grill. That way everything's clamped in position and we can go around and do the forming work. It may move or twist a little bit on the hammer form, so don't be surprised if you've got to reset it. Now the grill is radiused, I've just gone around on the belt linisher and deburred the edges. Any open sharp edges can catch on the sheet metal of the radiator shroud. So the process now is we'll have to put it in at a slight angle, a little bit of a bend, and then it will pop in. I've got the grill fitting the radiator shroud now, but for final assembly, what we'll do is a little bit of urethane in each of the corners, so that way it holds it in place. Well done, you're making great progress. The radiator shroud was a particularly hard piece to form, so we can now proceed to make the hinge bonnet and the sides.